After delivering a project, so do you ever get time or you ever get called from those campus to revisit the campus and experience how the learners are experiencing those spaces? And have you ever observed that learners are using the spaces differently than what you conveyed to them?
One of the most poignant memories for me is I went to the Healthy Planet School a few months after the school had been inaugurated, and on the first concrete column that you see when you enter, there were some words that had been written by the teachers to inspire the students.
Now moving to your amazing work for IIT, Institute of Engineering and Technology in Ahmedabad University. So what was the story behind the architecture and design of this institute?
Some of the things we did was using the architectural elements as protagonists, as the Shah Rukh Khans and the Amitabh Bachchans of the space. So the stairs, for instance, are really... But we were very clear that this was not a building that was trying to copy CEPT or IIM or St. Xavier's or NID. It was its own new way of reinterpreting contemporary architecture for the 21st century.
What are the points of difference while you are designing, let's say, a learning space for early years or school architecture and the one for higher education?
When we were designing the Healthy Planet School, we knew the early years students are going to be maybe 2 years old, 3 years old. Their eyes are 2 feet above the earth. When you're designing a higher education facility like a university or the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, most of the inhabitants are adults. Their eyes are 4.5 feet above or 5 feet above the surface of the earth, depending on how tall they are. So just that sensitivity to understanding how someone is going to view, perceive, inhabit our building made us scale things very differently. At the Healthy Planet School, all the windows come low to the ground, so no child ever feels denied a view into another space.
Hello, namaste, and welcome to this podcast episode by Global Learning Space Network that is dedicated to the celebration of progress of educational architecture and learning spaces. This is the first ever podcast episode by GLSN, and today we have the honor of hosting architect Pankaj Vir Gupta, who serves as a co-founder and principal of Vir.Mueller Architects, and as well as he is also the visiting faculty at the School of Architecture, University of Virginia. Welcome to this podcast, Pankaj sir.
Thank you.
So first question is, like, since you have designed so many amazing learning spaces that went on to win so many awards, like the Healthy Planet School or be it the Institute of Engineering and Technology of Ahmedabad University. So first question coming up to you is, what is the core design philosophy that guides you while you're designing learning spaces?
I think the core design philosophy that guides us is a very simple, eternal, timeless philosophy. My vision of a perfect learning space is a beautiful large banyan tree with prop roots coming down at various intervals, creating a large open space filled with shade and dappled sunlight, under which students are sitting with their teachers. Now, if you think of that image for a second, it is so simple and yet so timeless that no architecture can even come close. That's my philosophy. How do we approximate that experience in the buildings, in the spaces, in the learning environments that we create?
And sir, how can you share the story behind the architecture and design of Healthy Planet School, since it has, as we have read, that it has been conceptualized as a cocoon and it is also for the early years. So what's the story behind it?
The story behind that particular project was a visionary client, Arunabh Singh, who is the director of the Healthy Planet School, coming to us to say, I have no preconceived notion of what this environment for academics, education, for early years learning should be. All I know is that it should be absolutely exemplary in the standards and the benchmarks it sets for design and construction, and then hence facilitates learning. So we were given a site which was surrounded by very tall, nondescript urban towers, which is now unfortunately the state of most of India's cities as they're urbanizing. The quality of the general architecture that you see being built around is not very inspiring. The idea of the cocoon, hence, was a reaction to giving children and their teachers a very safe, nurturing space, free from the prying windows and the eyes of all of these towers surrounding the site, and yet creating an internal ecosystem which would be exemplary.
So how did you ensure movement and fluidity, since learners who are in early years, they need to move around? So how did you ensure that?
So if you've been to the school or if you've seen photographs of the school, you'll see the central space is a courtyard. And again, that courtyard comes from the idea which is rooted deeply in Indian academic tradition, the monastic quadrangle, the angan, the central court of a university campus. The idea that you move around a central space, a unifying space, an egalitarian space welcoming everybody, with galleries and circulation on the periphery. So at Healthy Planet School, we created an organic form, a fluid form. We didn't want any sharp corners for the children. We didn't want any blind spots for the children of the faculty. So they can move fluidly and freely around the angan, around the central courtyard. And so you have these gallery spaces around. And from those gallery spaces, you go into the internal learning areas and the shared areas for music, for dance, the cafeteria, etc. Everything is circumscribed around that courtyard and the galleries.
And we've also seen that you've given special focus on the wayfinding and the signages inside this learning space and the colors used on those. So how do you think the color psychology or the colors impact the learning experience?
So we were very fortunate. We worked with Studio MDA. They are based in Brazil and in Belgium. And Luciana Matello, the founder of Studio MDA, is a visionary. So we worked closely with her. She looked at the architecture. She looked at how the colors of the architecture were organic. The color of the brick, the color of the concrete, the color of the beechwood slats. Nothing has been painted. It's left in its natural state. So she said, I need to come up with a signage palette that is harmonious with these organic colors of the material. And so that's how she developed this palette to create the signage in a fluid way, synergizing it with the architecture.
And how the other spatial elements like the lighting, air, and acoustics played an important role while you were designing this learning environment.
So the lighting is ideally daylight. What we've done in the central court is create a tented canopy which diffuses natural light all day. So you're always able to see what the shadows and the light from the sun is doing. We created some beautiful skylights in the stairs and in the light courts, so the children can see the power of the mighty sun. They can see the geometries, the shadows of the earth's movement around the sun result in on the walls of the building. And then finally, in a very simple way, we suspended lights from the ceiling with the exposed concrete slabs to give a kind of sense of equivalent diffuse light when the dusk falls or when there's a particularly overcast day. And then to highlight certain walls where the students' art or projects are being displayed, we have track lighting.
Pretty interesting. And like you told that even the paints were not used on the bricks and walls. So what kind of materials were used and what was the philosophy behind this?
So the building is a concrete structure. All of the structural elements are made of poured concrete. We made the formworks on site to pour the concrete in steel. Once the concrete was poured into those forms and the forms were removed, the natural color of the concrete, which is the pigment it derives from cement and sand and admixture, was left untouched. It was just cleaned with water. And then the only additional primary element of the walls is the exposed brick, which is a machine molded brick made with the local clay. We use that brick. It's very strong. It can withstand variations in temperature. It can withstand rain and dust. And it never loses its luster, its kind of earthiness. So those were the two primary materials. The flooring was largely terrazzo, which is a white cement mixed with crushed stone. And that gives its own subtlety of color. And then the final predominant color palette is the slats of timber which wrap the gallery. So these are the four hard and soft materials that constitute the building. This is a building that didn't need interior design. The building itself tells you how to inhabit it, how to occupy it. And then, of course, Aruna very carefully selected really beautiful timber furniture to complement the architecture for all of the classrooms.
In this answer, you mentioned that these materials could withstand the test of temperature and other elements. And now we know that Noida falls in the seismic zone 4 that is prone to earthquakes of magnitude as high as 4.0. So how did you ensure seismic sustainability in this learning space?
Well, all structural codal requirements for seismic zone design in the Delhi NCR region mandate zone 4 seismic activity, which can be beyond 4 on the Richter scale. So the building has been designed to adequately compensate for that.
And what's your take on how built environment can support the multisensory learning of the learners?
I think it has a huge environmental impact on multisensory learning. I was fortunate to attend St. Columba's School, which is also an exposed brick building built in the 1940s in Delhi. And I was always amazed by how the brick had lasted decades and maintained its kind of scale, its organic form, continued to be a kind of emblematic, in my mind, an emblematic material of my memories of my time, my 13 years at St. Columba's School. Also, there was a modernist building on the campus that was designed in the 60s by the great architect Mr. Kanvinde, which was concrete and plaster. So those were very inspiring early environments for me. I went to the University of Virginia, where the campus was designed by the legendary Thomas Jefferson, president of the US and the founder of the university. I studied architecture then at Yale, where my architecture building was designed by Paul Rudolph. So I think I've been very fortunate that my own learning environments have had these incredible architectural uh, protagonists to teach me, to guide me. And that probably also in some way has influenced my desire to be the architect of academic educational learning spaces.
And what's the difference that you find in the learning environments that you experienced outside India and in India?
I think the environment plays a major role. I studied carefully the campus that Rabindranath Tagore developed at Shantiniketan. Very few people know that he had been inspired by the Bauhaus. He had made a trip to Germany. He had seen how this revolutionary idea of education, which encompassed the arts and music and fine arts in particular, there was a particular emphasis on humanities. And yet, everyone, all the students and the faculty, lived in very beautiful campus setting where some of the idiosyncrasies of the faculty were allowed to be manifest in the buildings themselves. There was not this idea that there's a straitjacket or a code that determines how everything ought to look. The freedom, the idea of freedom was embodied in that campus. For me, that has remained an inspiration. Some of the most exemplary campuses, including the ones I've studied at in the US or taught at, or even my own school campuses in Delhi at St. Columbus, also fostered that synergy between environment, culture, ecology, and architecture. I think that is the ambition that we as architects at Vir.Mueller want to bring to every project. Unfortunately, in our cities, I think we are often blindsided by the low quality of design and low quality of construction, especially in many of these public buildings. That's what we are trying to fight back against and improve and upgrade the standard of those spaces.
And how do you address the context, the culture, and inclusivity while designing learning spaces?
I think by being really honest and transparent with our clients, being honest and transparent with the materiality and the craftsmanship that is available in a particular place. No two schools we design are identical. No two landscapes, no two geographies are identical. When we did the Ahmedabad University building, it was very different in its material sensibility and its context, being the hot, arid setting of Ahmedabad. Whereas when we did the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, which is walking distance from Connaught Place, it's a very different environment. We did the NCAER and ICRIER buildings, which are think tanks and research organizations in prominent sites in Delhi, again, very different. When we did the Museum for Humayun's Tomb on the site of the World Heritage Monument of Humayun's Tomb for the Aga Khan, we were very careful again because it's a museum, but it's also a learning space. It teaches you about culture, it teaches you about your history, it teaches you about a mighty empire that once flourished on this site. In all of these buildings, the unifying factor in our design, in our architecture, is the simplicity and the elegance for elevating the user experience, materially and spatially. Natural light, natural materials, a sense of scale in congruence with the human body, very, very important factors that we consider.
And when you are designing learning environments, how do you address the inclusivity of all the learners?
I think the inclusivity of all the learners is addressed by keeping the architecture very simple. For instance, at the Healthy Planet School, the idea that as the children move around, they are always in visible kind of proximity to a teacher or to a fellow student. There's a transparency about that. There's no blind corners. At the Humayun's tomb, I'm calling it a learning space as well as a museum, we designed beautiful broad ramps, very gently sloped as per the standards for a wheelchair accessible person to be able to comfortably navigate, because we insisted that the museum should elevate everybody, old and young, with whatever infirmity or ability they had, to feel equivalently treated, respected, and given dignity. That was a premise of our architecture at that museum. We bring that to the schools also by emphasizing the importance of the connection between every individual learner, student, person who experiences architecture with nature. Natural light is a very important factor in this. Landscape and ecological introduction of the environment is very important. Sometimes it's hard to do, but we try our best to do that.
And how do you integrate your design with the curriculum needs of those schools?
Well, we are not following different design principles because the curriculum is different. We are following universal design principles. Obviously, it's code compliant. Obviously, it's safe. Obviously, the parameters that the user group or the client sets for us as their functional need are being followed. But the architecture is responding to universal principles. What is the ideal scale of a room? What is the ideal introduction of natural light into that room? How is that space able to inspire someone? What is the choice of material that we are going to use? So those are conscious design decisions made by us as architects.
And how does the built environment impacts the health and well-being of educators as well as learners?
Well, I mean, simple thing, if you're using organic materials, then you're not subjecting the users or the inhabitants of a building to, say, for instance, the odors and the off-gassing that certain laminates or glues release into the environment. If you're not using paint, then again, many paints have lead content or other harmful heavy metal content in them. You're removing all of that from the environment. So even by osmosis, even by engagement, those things that are not healthful for the human body are minimized in our architectural premise. By not doing false ceilings as much as possible in our buildings, we are preventing the accumulation of mold or dust or other pathogens that might be breeding or fostering, in places that they are hard to see, but they have an impact on respiratory health, etc. So we try and kind of keep it clean, simple, and transparent.
And how does these learning environments designed by you consider the aspect that the next generation of learners would have different needs and would have different perspectives while coming into those learning spaces?
Well, I mean, I think again, I follow the terminology of universal space. I mean, if you're creating a building based on a set of principles that are timeless, then the change of a curriculum shouldn't change the spatial narrative at all. In fact, I would actually go on to say that when people become overly fussy about interior design and trying to be contemporary, they actually are doing a disservice to the space. Elemental, simple space is timeless. When I go to see how Gandhiji lived in his ashram on the banks of the Sabarmati, I am inspired so enormously that this simple hut built on the banks of the river gave shelter and sustenance to perhaps one of the greatest thinkers of India. There was no architectural flourish, it was really distilled simplicity. That's the ethos that we follow in this office.
And after delivering a project, so do you ever get time or do you ever get called from those campus to revisit the campus and experience how the learners are experiencing those spaces? And have you ever observed that learners are using the spaces differently than what you conveyed to them?
That's one of the great pleasures of being an architect, that the users who enjoy the spaces we've designed are the most honest communicators of their feedback. And we have been very fortunate, especially in the design of our academic and our public buildings, that so many hundreds of users who use these buildings come back to us, they message us, they email us, they call us, they write to us, and they say how much they enjoy studying, teaching, and learning in these buildings. One of the most poignant memories for me is I went to the Healthy Planet School a few months after the school had been inaugurated. And on the first concrete column that you see when you enter, there were some words that had been written by the teachers to inspire the students. And I was just moved to see that a structural column in concrete was being used with chalk by the teachers as the first primary mode of instruction. So I felt really rejuvenated and really moved to see that the architecture itself is becoming a canvas for education.
Have you ever worked on co-designing the learning spaces? Like architects plus educators and learners, all of their viewpoints are considered.
So, in all the spaces we've designed, for instance, at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, or at the Healthy Planet School, we take a lot of input from the educators who are going to use the infrastructure. We take advantage of their experience and their user feedback from having worked, lived, taught, and inhabited other buildings, to distill that into the design philosophy that we then generate. So there's obviously user feedback at the outset, and that's what then allows us to create or propose a design.
Okay. So that was all about the school architecture. Now moving to your amazing work for IIT, Institute of Engineering and Technology in Ahmedabad University. So what was the story behind the architecture and design of this institute?
Well, I mean, that building is now over 10 years old. We were invited to participate in a competition with 6 other architects, including the legendary Mr. Balkrishna Doshi and other architects. And we came up with this idea of a design around a central courtyard, because in Ahmedabad, the legacy of high quality academic architecture is really super. Obviously, people are well familiar with the Louis Khan's Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. Hasmukh Patel designed an exquisite campus for St. Xavier's School. And Balkrishna Doshi himself had done a really lyrical building for the SEPT School of Architecture. The NID building by Geeta Sarabhai is one of my favorites. So we were really in awe of how the city had fostered these incredible campus environments for really making itself the leading, I think, city of learning in contemporary India. Using that as a springboard, we came up with our design of a building that would simply, again, around a central courtyard garden, landscaped beautifully in its conception by Muhammad Shahir, the late great Indian landscape architect, foster a creative environment for 2,000 students and about 250 faculty. Some of the things we did was using the architectural elements as protagonists, as the Shah Rukh Khans and the Amitabh Bachchans of the space. So the stairs, for instance, are really prominent in the way. There's a stair that kind of slowly cascades down one side of the courtyard. There's another stair that comes forward into the courtyard as a kind of lead actress in the space. There are moments where the stone screens start to flutter and billow, reflecting light and shadow. So there's a kinetic energy in that building that is quite powerful. But we were very clear that this was not a building that was trying to copy SEPT or IIM or St. Xavier's or NID. It was its own new way of reinterpreting contemporary architecture for the 21st century.
And how did you ensure thermal comfort in IET?
So obviously, as you know, Ahmedabad gets very, very hot in the summer. And what we did was we oriented the building optimally to the north and the south for exposure. We minimized the exposure to the west, which is the hottest sun. We created a kind of air cavity between the sandstone screen and the internal block walls that air is an excellent insulator. So you already reduce the amount of heat load that the building is absorbing. And then finally, by almost shading in a non-air conditioned, passive cooling manner all of the circulation, the gallery around the courtyard with sandstone screens, you create a much lower thermal load for the air conditioning to have to address. So I remember initially when we designed that building, which is almost 230,000 square feet, the air conditioning engineers thought we would need 950 tons of air conditioning. When they saw what we had designed for that same amount of area, the final air conditioning load was 450 tons, almost half. So I think the ethos of the design was ecologically very appropriate.
And how do you balance environmental and ecological aspects when you are faced with budget constraints while designing learning space?
Well, I think actually there's no conflict. A budget constraint should make you more ecological and more environmental in your outlook. We work very closely with fantastic structural engineers, Himanshu Parikh and Rishikesh Patel. 15, 16, 17 years ago, when we first started our collaboration, Himanshu said to me, he said, For every bar of reinforcement steel that you use, imagine how many trees are being cut. I have never forgotten his words then. They were prescient because it made me understand that I, as an architect, am responsible for the structural simplicity of what resource gets consumed by my building. And that's an environmental decision. If you make a cantilever without columns, you're using a lot more steel. Using a lot more steel means a lot more mining, a lot more cutting of trees, a lot more damage to our very fragile planet. So we have really simplified and learnt from great teachers like our structural engineer Himanshu Parekh, like our landscape architect Mohammad Shahir, how to create the simplest, most elemental resource usage possible to make a powerful architecture.
And what are the points of difference while you are designing, let's say, a learning space for early years or school architecture and the one for higher education?
So I think the biggest difference is the viewpoint of the child. When we were designing the Healthy Planet School, we knew the early years students are going to be maybe 2 years old, 3 years old. Their eyes are 2 feet above the earth. When you're designing a higher education facility like a university or the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, most of the inhabitants are adults. Their eyes are 4.5 feet above or 5 feet above the surface of the earth, depending on how tall they are. So just that sensitivity to understanding how someone is going to view, perceive, inhabit our building made us scale things very differently. At the Healthy Planet School, all the windows come low to the ground, so no child ever feels denied a view into another space. That's as simple as you can be.
Okay. And what are the trends that you think are going to shape the learning environments of future?
I am not really aware of trends. I think trends are fatuous because they come and go. They are ephemeral because they are non-universal, eternal. I follow principles that hopefully will last a long time. They are timeless. So I'm not interested in trends.
Okay. And to all the young architects, designers, and educators who would be listening to this podcast and watching this podcast, what would be your message to them who would be designing the learning spaces of future?
Listen carefully to your children, to your educators. Listen carefully to what the environment, the ecology of our fragile planet is telling you. Never lose sight of the fact that without integrity, without utmost honesty, you cannot make great space. So you have to really be absolutely, it's kind of a sadhana. When we researched our first book, which was on Golconda, a building built by the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, that research taught us how the principles of truth and integrity were largely responsible for the making of a great building. Even today, after 85 years, that building, Golconda in Pondicherry, is one of the high watermarks of any built work of architecture on our great subcontinent. That learning experience taught me, and that's why I'm now saying this in your podcast to the people who may be watching, especially young architects, always follow integrity as your paradigm. There is no compromise possible if you want to make great work.
And what would be your definition of learning environments?
All environments are learning environments.
Like not just confined to schools or colleges, libraries, or maker spaces.
Yeah, sometimes the most powerful learning environment is a beautiful garden. Nature tells you what you need to know. Yeah.
Perfect. So I think that was all the questions and amazing discussions we had for you. And thank you for being on this podcast. It was an honor to host you for the first ever episode, sir.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Good luck with your venture.
Thank you so much. To all the people watching us and to all the people listening to this podcast, thank you for being here and listening to the amazing insights shared by architect Pankaj Vir Gupta from Vir.Mueller Architects. It was an honor to host him for the first ever podcast episode of Global Learning Space Network. For more amazing insights about educational architecture and learning spaces, keep following the pages of Global Learning Space Networks on all the platforms of social media as well as digital. And thank you for being here. It was an honor to have you with us.